Welcome, everyone, for our final session in this convening. If, like me, you have had the opportunity to be at sessions yesterday and today, you know that this has been an incredibly rich and thought-provoking convening about Israel at the crossroads. We were especially honored to have Attorney General Mandelblit with us last night, and he spoke very pointedly about the role of the Attorney General, for which we are grateful. Today, we have two experts. I guess everybody who's been on a panel has been an expert. You're all experts. But I do want to introduce, and there is no political implication as to who is to my right and who is to my left. But at least as we're seated.
We're both to your right?
We're both to your right.
I know, it's like, so let's start with Dahlia Scheindlin. Dahlia is a fellow at the Century International based in Tel Aviv. She is a public opinion expert and an international political and strategic consultant, as well as scholar and writer. She is the author of, hold up the book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, which was published in September of 2023, so just before October 7th. I do want to say that for me, this is probably one of the best books on Israel I have read, maybe in my life, but surely in the last 10 years. So I'm going to hold it up again so you can all see it. Take out your phones now and order it. It's really, really must reading.
Paperback.
If you want to know what's going on in
Get the
Israel.
paperback. It is.
Yes, it is in paperback.
It's too expensive.
In fact, now I'm going to give her back the hardback. Dahlia conducts ongoing joint Israeli-Palestinian public opinion surveys together with the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research. And she completed her PhD in political science at Tel Aviv University. Next to her, I'm not going to say to her right, next to her is Lihi Ben-Shitrit. She is the director of the Taub Center for Israel Studies and the Henry Taub Professor of Israel Studies at the Skirball Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies at NYU. So she came all the way from downtown. She holds her PhD, MPhil, and MA in political science from Yale University, that's a small school in Connecticut, and a BA in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton, another school, this one in New Jersey. So this is the academic center of the universe, of course. On October 8th, 2023, Lihi immediately set out to document the voices from Israel, asking how Israel came to the Gaza war and whether we can find grounds for hope and reconciliation in the future. The result is her edited book. She contributed it not only an introduction, but as well, I think a chapter in it. It is unbelievably provocative reading. It will make your heart pound hard, but it will also help you understand Israel and Gaza. So again, I've now given you two books of must reading. There won't be a quiz at the end, but pardon me? Thank you. The Gates of Gaza. The Gates of Gaza, subtitled Critical Voices from Israel on October 7th and the War with Hamas. Judy, come on up to the front row. So we prepared, and in our preparation, we've decided, which is to say I decided, that we'd like Dahlia to start actually speaking for a bit. And then when she is done, Lihi will respond, so, or rebut, as the case may be. But Dahlia, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for inviting me, Burt, and thank you to Lihi for being a discussant. Thank you to everybody for hosting me. I was charged with kind of trying to figure out how to sum up both a bit of the conference, but particularly sum up the situation of Israel right now. And we decided to focus on what I see as the three most important areas of life in Israel right now, which I see as a matter of three dilemmas or three sets of crossroads. And we can always, pretty much at any time, anywhere, you can say, we're at a crossroads. But I think that it is more realistic now than ever. It's really exactly where we are. The paths that we're on are fundamentally different from things that came before. And in those three areas of what I'm going to talk about now are the situation of the war, the situation of Israeli politics, which is always fun for people, but it is actually our real life. It's not just fun, and the situation of democracy. And on all of those things, I'm going to try to outline the pathways, looking at where the country and society seems to be going at present, as I see it in my analysis, and what is the alternative. And that I see as the crossroads that we face on each of these areas. So I'll just talk for a while until you guys tell me to stop, and then Lihi will respond. I think on the issue of the war, so where do we stand now? The path that we're on at present is the path that is being led by the current government that is leading the country and leading the country's policy on the war. As you all know, the war restarted in full force, a full-blown resurgence of the war as of, I believe it was the 18th of March. Israel has begun to bombard also through aerial bombardments and with ground operations. And the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister are speaking very consistently in recent days about taking territory in Gaza. And they use the term in Hebrew, lekachat. They're just saying we're going to take territory. And the Defense Minister actually used the term nitzaref. We will join that territory. Depends on which day and which statement you look at. But they are talking about this increasingly openly. And so if there is not a ceasefire or an end to the war, that seems to be where the government will be taking the current campaign in Gaza. And ironically, even as I wrote my notes and I left, from 111th Street to walk over here this afternoon, and by the time I got here, there was another communique from the Prime Minister saying we are taking a whole new swath, a kind of corridor in Gaza right now. So this is not theoretical. This is the pace of these kinds of statements coming from Prime Minister and his ministers has been accelerating. We see also very, very open statements about encouraging Palestinian emigration or expulsion from Gaza. Usually the language is emigration, voluntary emigration, but of course under conditions of the war that make life essentially impossible in Gaza, especially if there's no reconstruction. And so it's very hard to see that as anything other than a forced emigration. All of that will lead to a situation where if Israel takes control and establishes policies that advance immigration or expulsion on some level, what we have heard other government ministers talking about, actually for about a year, at least a year now, I think I first noticed it in January 2024, is the possibility of establishing a military government in Gaza. Our finance minister has been discussing this, again, from the beginning, practically, and I think it will be inevitable if the war doesn't end. And of course, there are other ministers in the government, backed by certain communities, who have been advocating from the start to reestablish settlements in Gaza. And anecdotally, every few weeks nowadays, we hear about people trying to infiltrate, like Israeli Jews trying to sneak into Gaza. It seems strange. Why would a civilian just try to sneak into Gaza when it's a destroyed war zone? Well, because they want to kind of establish a little foothold. I should also point out that in the West Bank, there has been a very significant military operation going on since, by my count, about the 18th, roughly, of January, shortly after the ceasefire went into effect, which is the second such very extensive military operation in the heavily populated cities. In Area A, that has been nominally under Palestinian Authority control to some extent over the years, but these extensive military operations are very widespread. They have not ended at this point. There's the military operation in the Jenin area and the Tulkarem area are ongoing, in addition to expanding settlements in general throughout the West Bank. And so what we see is something like, and this government, by the way, let me go back to the early statements of this government when it was established, before the war. The government was established in late 2022, and its founding document outlining its principles says, essentially declares an intention to establish Jewish control over all of the areas of the land of Israel, including Judea and Samaria. That's written in the government's own agreement. So that is the path of this government. That's where this government, by its own statements and actions, seem to be taking the country. Having said that, also, we should remember that Hamas still exists. Hamas has not been replaced or destroyed. It has been severely weakened. It has been severely incapacitated, partly, but it has also been recruiting more. And I think just a few hours ago, there were also rockets fired from parts of Gaza. So what we see is essentially, if this path continues, there will be extensive control over Gaza, possibly some form of annexation, including, alongside a de facto annexation within the West Bank. And we will see an ongoing insurgency by the remnants of Hamas, which will constantly try to rebuild itself. And I think there will be an ongoing insurgency and counterinsurgency. That's the current path. There is an alternate path, and this is the crossroads we're talking about with relation to the war. And in that alternate path, we've seen this play out in its initial stages. There will be some sort of a ceasefire. We saw the first stage of the ceasefire that was put into place in January and lasted for about 2 months. In another scenario, the negotiations that are sometimes happening, sometimes not, I mean, it's a mediated process, right? These are not direct negotiations, but they reach some sort of the next stage of a deal, which involves eventually the release of all of the Israeli hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza, and in return, ultimately, a permanent ceasefire and withdrawal of most forces, at least, in some fashion, from Gaza. I think that if we're really looking at an alternative path with relation to the war and the conflict with the Palestinians and occupation, that early stage of ending this phase of the war, a second stage which involves hostage release and a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire, would then lead to a bigger process, a longer-term process, which would have to have the complete commitment and participation of Israel's allies, the United States. Who knows if this government is committed to that or not? It's hard to know what this president wants with relation to Israel or other parts of the world. It's very easy to know what he wants with relation to America, actually. But let's say there is a longer-term process that involves involvement, commitment of the U.S., of Arab states who are allies of Israel, the possibility of normalizing with other Arab states, particularly Saudi Arabia, and of course the European community, who is always committed to advancing some sort of political framework. And I think that we should assume that this will involve regional normalization deals and regional participation with Israel and other Arab partners that supports a diplomatic resolution of the conflict with the Palestinians in a way that ends occupation and leads to Palestinian self-determination in some form. And when I say in some form, we don't know, certainly it's not going to be something immediate, it will be a process, but the question is whether it's a real process, a genuine process, or what some of the language now talks about, an irreversible process. And that will probably happen in the form of a Palestinian state, what we call a two-state solution, in some form. Personally, I think the old version of a complete international division and a hard partition cannot happen anymore. I don't see how it would be implemented. I do think it will be two states in a partnership-based association, something like a confederation along the lines of the European Union, but again, backed by, I think, a number of outside actors who will either support and lead this process or maybe even try to pressure the sides to get to this process. But the two sides, Israelis and Palestinians, in some sort of two-state arrangement would, again, because I don't think hard partition can really happen, I think you will have two states that end up cooperating and having an association where they deal with the core issues together: economy, security policy, natural resources, public health, residency and citizenship. But we can talk about this different approach to a two-state solution separately. What I think is that ultimately you have this alternative pathway, the step to resolving the immediate conflict leading to a longer-term process for comprehensive resolution, which will never happen under the current government. And that brings me to the second major crossroads, which is Israeli politics. Okay, because the current government will not take the second path. The current government is well on the way towards the first path. So what is the chance for a change of government? Let's go through the two scenarios. I think there are two major scenarios. You can call it a crossroads, but it's a crossroads the Israeli public will have, well, hopefully will have a say in. One path in that crossroads is that Netanyahu will stay in power. Okay, after October 7th, there was a lot of talk about in the Israeli community, in Israeli kind of analysts and even people who said, he'll never survive this. Remember that? He'll never survive this. He can't continue governing after this disaster. And here we are. So he manages to stay around. Now, how could those things happen? One, the original coalition that won the elections in November 2022 had 4 parties. Now they're actually 5 parties because 2 of them broke up. But those parties could still win an election just as they are. They could. Now, it's unlikely, based on current polling, and not just current polling, but polling ever since January 2023. So within about a month after the government was elected, this particular coalition had lost its majority in surveys. Okay, surveys are just a reflection, they're not an actual election. But they've been very consistent. And by contrast to pretty much every other country, when a war breaks out, the first thing you see is the rallying effect, right? Support for the government goes way up. Remember, after 9/11, support for George W. Bush went way up. After Russia invaded Ukraine, support for Zelensky went way up. In Israel, we had the opposite effect. Support for the government collapsed. The current government, the parties of the coalition held 64 seats out of 120 in the Knesset. All polling showed them in the mid-40-seat range. So they had lost about a third of their votes as a coalition. Netanyahu's personal ratings in all surveys collapsed to the lowest I've seen him, I think, really at any time in the last 15 years. He fell 20 points behind all other competitors on a personal level, and trust in the government in a generic sense went down to below 20%. The Likud itself lost about half of its support in surveys, and that situation was very stable for about the first 6 months. Since about April of 2024, polls consistently show the government has recovered to a certain point. It has recovered to where it was before the war, not to where it was in the November 2022 elections. So those parties of the coalition are now polling at around 52, 54, 55 seats out of 120. They still don't have 61. But that's not so far. By the time of the next elections, which will probably be held in late 2026, the government having passed a budget, stabilized itself, brought in more parties to the coalition, now is a bit bigger. So by that time, they could still simply win an election along the lines of the original parties of the coalition. That's one way Netanyahu stays in power. Another way is that the original parties of the coalition, Likud, Shas, Torah Judaism, and the combination of religious Zionism and the Jewish Power Party, maybe they can't win in a majority. Maybe they only get 52, 53 seats like they're getting in surveys now. But as we say in Hebrew, Elohim Gadol, there are lots of parties in Israel. We often have 35 to 40 parties running in elections. We often have between 8 and 13 that enter Knesset. And Netanyahu's the most seasoned politician in Israel. He's also one of the most veteran politicians in Israel, having entered Knesset in the late 1980s. And he knows better than anybody how to orchestrate the political system. Who knows, he might find new coalition partners and manage to get a majority after the elections, okay, by building a coalition. And the last option, which I think is a long shot, I hope it's a long shot, but there could be a way to postpone elections and simply not hold them, at least as scheduled. I think it's difficult because we have a basic law, and it's one of the few articles in the basic laws of Israel, and we had a very good background lecture on the basic laws that showed you there's only 12 of them. Are we up to 13 now? 12, 13. But most of them are not even entrenched, and I think Attorney General Mendelblit said yesterday that many of them, if they're not entrenched, can be changed by 2 to 1 in Knesset if they're not entrenched. This particular clause, this article about the date of elections is entrenched by a 2/3 majority in Knesset. You need 80 members of Knesset to change the article that specifies that elections should be held after 4 years. But there are interpretations. There are ways to change it. And it's not impossible that the government would try those interpretations or simply put so much pressure on the kinds of civil liberties that you need to have meaningful elections that the elections are no longer as meaningful because the opposition has been stifled and people's ability to run or parties are more easily rejected in the political system. And this is what we've seen in some of the other countries facing democratic decline. Not something as crude as canceling elections altogether, but simply making them less meaningful by having less space within civil society to form opposition, to express opinions, less free media, etc. That's one path for Israeli politics. The other path, okay, I don't like predicting ever, but I think I feel pretty comfortable predicting that there's not going to be a left-wing victory in Israel anytime soon. However, most likely, the parties that are doing very well in all surveys throughout this time are right-wing parties that are basically right-wing in terms of their security approach. They are right-wing in terms of, oftentimes they have a strong militarist approach. They are nationalists, but they are not religious parties per se. Certainly, they're not messianic or fundamentalist theocratic parties like religious Zionism and the Jewish Power Party. And those are the parties that are doing very well. The party run by Benny Gantz, the party of Avigdor Lieberman, right? Israel Bitenu is also doing very well in survey research. And so those are the parties that could possibly win a majority of the parliamentary seats, in addition to parties of the center, parties of the left. What's interesting, actually, is the party representing the Israeli left right now is polling at around 13 or 14 seats. The leader of that party, Yair Golan, merged two smaller left-wing parties, and in the current Knesset, those parties only held 4 seats, and now they're polling at 13, 14, which is an interesting dynamic in itself. But all of those parties together could possibly win a coalition majority, especially if they put another Arab party into the coalition. Israel did it once in terms of independent Arab parties. It wasn't that long ago. It was deeply controversial. It led to some backlash. But I think from a democratic perspective, what could be more democratic than having parties represented in the governing coalition who represent Israel's biggest national minority? So, this is a matter of bold leadership. It doesn't look likely, but this is part of the alternate scenario for building a government. It will be very hard to imagine an alternate government, even with the success of those sort of center, secular right-wing parties. It will still be very hard for them to put a coalition together if they don't put an Arab party in their coalition. We don't know, but it is one of the possible future scenarios. And that kind of a government, again, it's going to be led by right-wing parties, so they're not going to take a path of embracing, open negotiations for a two-state solution, et cetera. But they will have to make a critical decision, if they want to take an alternate path, to ultimately decide that Israel is not committed to territorial expansionism. Right now, by the way, Israel is not only de facto, in many ways, annexing the West Bank and laying a groundwork for annexation in Gaza, but Israel also has a military presence right now in Syria and in Lebanon. The government has stated that it does not plan to evacuate those positions anytime soon. So it looks very much like there's an expansionist kind of vision, and a different path with a different Israeli political leadership could decide that that is not Israel's goal, and it is not Israel's interest, and that Israel would prefer to keep its global membership among democratic allies, leverage those allies, or be pressured by them, because they're not going to be as sophisticated as Netanyahu in avoiding pressure from allies, if there is such pressure. And they might decide that Israel actually needs to make a decision with relation to the Palestinians, which is something it's never really wanted to do, or at least not totally name, other than the attempts to negotiate, which have not come to fruition in past years. And that also, both sides bear some responsibility for that, which should be said. But I think this ending point for the second scenario of politics leads us to what I think is the deepest dilemma at all, and that's Israel's constitutional crisis. Okay, it is at a crossroads, but it's not, the crossroads, again, it's very easy to point out the first, one path of the crossroads. That's where we are now. We've been in a permanent constitutional crisis that evolves and adds new elements or new dimensions pretty much every few months. It never stopped. If you hear people say, well, the war ended the judicial assault, it didn't. It just changed form. I'm happy to talk about how. But that's the one path that the government has basically put before our eyes in January 2023 by announcing the judicial reforms. And I think the other path is what I call reconstitution of Israel. And what I mean by that is, A, that Israel needs a constitution, a formal constitution, not because I think constitutions can solve every problem. We're talking in the United States of America right now, and you have a great constitution, and you have a lot of problems. But I do think that a constitution, in a bigger sense, like with a small c, a constitutional, way of thinking, forces Israel to make decisions that it has not wanted to make since its establishment. Okay, one of the first biggest decisions that Israel has never really made is, where does the source of authority come from? Where does the source of authority come from? Is the source of authority from above, or is it from the people? In a democracy, the source of authority is supposed to come from the people. That doesn't mean you can't be religious. It doesn't mean you can't have a character of the state that is defined by the Jewish identity on some level. But what is the source of the authority of the state? There has never been a consensus about it. And as a result, you have specific communities who never felt themselves bound by the institution of the law. The question of equality has been fundamentally excluded from Israel's primary legislation when it comes to the basic equality of all citizens. It does not appear in our basic laws, okay? By implication, as I think Ro'i mentioned, the by implication in the basic law of human dignity and liberty, but it's all implied. And that's what I mean by not making decisions. The basic law of human dignity and liberty was only passed in 1992. Okay, up until then, we had no formal primary legislation for basic human rights. And even then, it doesn't explicitly say equality. It didn't say it. And then it was amended 2 years later to include a reference to the Declaration of Independence. And as the Supreme Court noticed in its hearing, or was argued in the Supreme Court in the hearing just over the reasonability clause back in July 2024, the legally binding nature of the Declaration of Independence is hotly disputed. All of this is by implication. So I think the question of equality has been left out of Israeli law, of course, not by accident, but because of these political dilemmas that began, from the moment of independence, and never actually making a decision on this, or depending on the courts, for example, depending on Supreme Court interpretation. A, leaves everything open to interpretation. B, puts the Supreme Court in the position of being attacked and politicized. And C, makes citizens wonder if it's truly an ethos of an Israeli society. So a constitution forces you to at least make a decision about that. A constitution doesn't force you, but should prompt a discussion and a decision about where Israel's borders are. What are Israel's borders? Okay, we have some better defined borders. Okay, we have some strong armistice lines. We have some peace agreements, but even the peace agreement with Jordan, if you actually try to figure out what is the border between Israel and Jordan, is it a hard international border? Who owns that border? Is it sovereign territory? It's the West Bank. So where are Israel's borders? And once you have defined borders, you also define who's a citizen. And people inside those borders should have the equal rights that I just talked about. And people who are not within Israel's borders should not be controlled by Israel. It's a pretty basic distinction that we understand for all other states. And finally, the question of a Jewish state. This came up in the last session. It was a very interesting discussion. And I think that, the old equation of you either have to be Jewish or democratic, or you are Jewish and democratic. I think that the idea that defining Israel as a Jewish state must come at the expense of democracy and equality, I don't see that. And I think that we see in other societies that are nation states with a national identity that you have, and again, I think this was mentioned in the previous panel, you have a preamble that can name a national identity alongside the commitment to the basic principles of democracy, equality of all citizens, basic human rights, and numerous examples of constitutions from around the world that also name the rights of collective rights of minorities in their country, even if they define themselves with a national identity. It involves reducing the Jewish state part of it to character, culture, things that are inclusive, that don't exclude necessarily other cultures within your community, rather than a definition of a Jewish state that is institutionalized and exclusive. So those are the dilemmas that if Israel is ready to make them, it can reach a constitution, and then I think it will have the foundations on which to build a sustainable democracy. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk to me.
Just before we turn to Lihi, I just want to ask a question about this Constitution thing. I would trust JTS to define the Jewish part of what would be Jewish in a Jewish state. And frankly, I would trust you to do the Constitution.
But I'm not a lawyer.
Yeah, but what about the current sitting prime minister? Would you trust him to write a Constitution?
Well, a constitution shouldn't be written by one person. A constitution should be written by convention, should be submitted to the public for review, for discussion over a period of time. The people doing the writing should represent different communities, different professional communities, different identity communities. The public discussion should be serious. It should be published in all of the, for the moment, independent media that we have in Israel, and possibly even submitted to a referendum. That's something that happens too. I can tell you the only referendum we have nowadays is survey research. Luckily, I know how to read surveys. And what's interesting is that as fragmented as Israeli society is, one of the things you've seen since January 2023 is a consistent majority, sometimes a 55% majority, sometimes 65%, who are fundamentally opposed to the kinds of judicial reforms the government was trying to make. And I'm calling them reforms purposely for the sake of the conversation. But obviously the protesters call it a judicial overhaul or assault or a coup. And I think that that majority has been very consistent. Now, if you have 55% of Israelis who oppose those reforms or who support the basic balance of powers, you must realize that it cuts across left, center, and right. Because the self-defined right wing in Israel is over 50%. Mm-hmm. The self-defined right wing among the Jewish population is over 60%. And yet you have about the same amount who reject the government's proposals for redefining democracy. So you see that the democracy issue, I think ironically, supersedes for Israelis the issue of Palestinians and occupation. I think it's a mistake to separate those. I don't see how they can be separated, but for most Israelis, they separate those issues, which is why the democracy issue does cut across to the right as well. But there is a growing portion, I should say it's actually I would say about a third to 40% who are fundamentally not committed to the basic tenets of liberal democracy. So there should be a broad representation of people who write a constitution and have a proper constitutional process.
Professor Ben-Shitrit.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. This was very, very eloquent and very thought-provoking, and I have some things to say, but I want to ask you some questions first. And I want to just tell the audience that my work has been on far-right politics in Israel and Palestine, and also comparatively, but I think these days I basically just study politics, right? Because far-right politics is just the definition of politics globally, not just in Israel or here, everywhere. And I have some things to say about that, but first I want to ask you about these really two major crossroads that you outlined that are existential. You're talking about, on the one hand, with relation to the war, a crossroad between taking over Gaza, instituting military rule, and ethnically cleansing Gaza, right? Destroying the population there completely, or ceasefire, bringing the hostages back, potentially reconstruction, going on a path that looks like a future. And then the other existential crossroad is constitutional conversation, going forward, thinking about Israeli democracy, or really a regime change into a new form of, I can call it, executive aggrandizement, but it's not. It's hybrid regime / potentially authoritarian. And it seems like in the way that you presented these two crossroads, there's so much uncertainty, and I want to ask you, where is the place for agency in these two issues of these two crossroads? Because what are the conditions? What are the resources? What are the things who are the players that can impact whether one path is taken or the other, both in terms of the war and in terms of Israeli democracy? Because I feel like a lot of us are in a state of, we're just feeling uncertain, confused, helpless, right? And there doesn't seem to be a lot of space for agency. So I'm wondering where you see place for agency, for actors, and for actual conditions that we can outline, okay, these are the things that we need in order for the path, the less, not the extreme dark path to be avoided on both of these issues. Sorry, I know it's a hard question, but please guide us.
Before I start, I would like to also say that Lihi's first book is excellent too, Righteous Transgressions, and I had the privilege of reviewing the book before we knew each other. But in terms, I also want to point out something that you said about the possibility that there will be a military government in Gaza and what did you say, like a hybrid, some semi-authoritarian regime in Israel. I think we really need to do away with the idea that these would be two separate regimes. First of all, I think it's an inaccurate description of the reality of occupation and Israel. I think it's a mistake to look at them as completely separate systems. All branches of government are involved in policy with relation to managing occupied territories, the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, of course. So there is a military regime, there is a military system in place, but it overlaps. There's so much that overlaps with Israel's law and Israel's implementation of that law that I think it's always a mistake to look at those as separate regimes, and even more so if Israel ends up really establishing a military government in Gaza and completing the de facto annexation of the West Bank, and maybe even de jure annexation of the West Bank. So Israelis will be living under that regime. It will be the same people implementing those regimes. I think that's part of how we got here, personally. In terms of who has agency to change this, I mean, it's a very difficult question. We've seen in Israel, I think, frankly, an extraordinary level of mobilization. I have never seen anything like it in Israel. And from what I could tell from the database of the Carnegie Endowment, where they have 800 different entries of social movements around the world, many countries have more than one entry of their social protests, the duration and the number of participants is at the very high range. And the elaborate nature of that mobilization in 2023 has really been nothing short of shocking to me. Especially because I advised numerous parties in the cycles of elections we had between 2019 and 2022. We had 5 election cycles, and I worked on 4 of those campaigns for different parties. And I work for parties, it's not a secret. I work for parties of the center, left, and leftward. And for pretty much all of them, I said, you have an opportunity to take on the democracy issue. This assault on the judiciary is really getting, it splits, different populations. And each time, the parties I was working for said, democracy, it's not sexy. It's not going to work. Well, anyway. So, the moment this judicial overhaul was published, we had, like 20,000 people at a demonstration. We said, oh my God. And then the next week, there were 100,000 people. And then it got to the point where 200,000 felt like a small demonstration because so many of them were even bigger. So the simple show of force actually was quite effective in 2023. There was a lot of questions about whether it's effective, but the fact is the government had a long list of pieces of legislation that it wanted to pass as part of this judicial overhaul or reform and various policies. And it wasn't able to do any of them except for one. It finally passed one law, and that law was overturned by the Supreme Court. And so it was I think that was at least partly because there was such a major backlash against it in 2023. Now, during the war, everything becomes more complicated because, the war intimidated people. In the first few weeks of the war, people couldn't go out. They were traumatized, tens of thousands, over 100,000, 150,000 people displaced, rockets being fired all the time on the places where we would go and demonstrate, especially in central Tel Aviv. And yet, within about 3 weeks or so, people were back out on the streets, this time for hostage release, because they had the impression that the government was not going to prioritize a hostage release very early on. And then, I can't go through every, ebb and flow of the protests, but in recent weeks, they've become enormous once again. And there's a big dilemma about whether they're having an impact or not. So I do think there's a limit to how much street demonstrations can really change things. There's no legal mechanism for turning street protests into political change.
Right.
That's not how the system works. So what does it do? Well, it helps, shore up a political camp. It gives rise to new leadership. It might help craft, ideas and messages. So those things can be important. But ultimately, there needs to be political mobilization, not just civic mobilization. I'm just making the distinction for the purposes of elections. And elections have to be won. Vision has to be adopted. People can't, there's been a bit of a political culture in Israel whereby opposition leaders think that if they are as vague as possible, they will do well, which actually has served them pretty well. But the time has come to actually put a vision before people and say that you need to vote for an alternative. And so that has to come from politicians as well. Ultimately, I think this has to be translated into political power. I wish I had better solutions, but those are the main ones I can think of.
So I want to ask, because you brought it up, and it's, to me, very powerful. So much of the demonstrations have been driven by the desire to bring home hostages. And that, for reasons that remain absolutely mysterious to me, does not seem to be a priority of the Netanyahu government at all. Full disclosure, this is personal to me. I had a young cousin who was taken hostage. Hirsch Goldberg, Poland. And Hirsch was murdered at the end of August of last year. And Hirsch's parents, who spoke eloquently and endlessly while he was captive, have now begun speaking out about ending the war and bringing the rest of the hostages home. And I just wonder, to what extent are the hostage families possibly going to be a political force?
I don't know. I mean, we've been thinking about this since the major protests against the judicial overhaul, that the leaders of those protests, and there was sort of ultimately kind of a coordinating group of leaders who just emerged from civil society. Many of them were, people who were successful in high tech and had a lot of money, but also the time to kind of help lead this. And there was a lot of talk about whether they would start to form a political party, but then the war happened. And now we have these very prominent figures who are, bereaved, traumatized, but some of them channeled their anguish into social activism on behalf of their loved ones. I mean, Anav Tsangalkar is the best example of this because she's somebody who really was not a political activist. In fact, she was a Likud supporter, but she has become the most vocal and most present and most prominent person in this leadership. And she's such a household name that I think a lot of people, would see her as a credible figure. And yet, who's to say? I mean, by the time we get to elections, it's a year and a half from now. Anybody who, well, as a political strategist, I'm going to say anybody who wants to run in the next elections should be starting that work right now, and not just by being prominent, but by actually building a party. And so I haven't heard of any of the hostage families taking on the initiative to register a party and start building branches and going around with that message yet. It could still happen. Israel has developed very immature political habits too. For example, starting a party, the night before they have to be registered for the next elections. I call them pop-up parties. It's not great, but it could be that as we get closer to elections, when we know they'll be happening, that some of these people will decide they want to use this, basis of public support, having represented, something beyond the hostages, because they have come to represent something beyond the hostages, and I think some of them are aware of that. But I think it's just too soon to say. I don't know. We only know of one person right now who's currently entering politics again, and that's Naftali Bennett, who announced that he's registering a new party, which was expected. But so far, we haven't actually heard formal new parties, either from the protest leaders or from the hostage families, although they may well be thinking about it behind the scenes. We just don't know. I do think, it could be an interesting thing. They might get a lot of votes. But in every election cycle, again, we have a new party that comes up and tries to rally people. They'll have to do something different. I do think that without proposing a real alternative pathway, they will become not only a pop-up party, but pop-up electoral success that will then decline. We've seen it over and over again in Israeli politics.
Can I ask you something connected to this, but trying to connect everything that you said about Israeli politics to American politics and American Jewish community. One of the things that I've noticed, and maybe I don't have my hand to the pulse exactly, is that the American Jewish community during the constitutional crisis, the judicial overhaul demonstration, was really understanding the crisis, the crisis of democracy in Israel, and understanding that the fault line lies between the Israeli public and Israeli democracy and the Israeli government and Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition members. October 7 came, and I think all of us felt under attack, felt, vulnerable in Israel and abroad. And a lot of that explicit criticism and explicit understanding of the danger of the Israeli government to the future of Israel, to democracy, to Israeli safety, security, kind of fizzled out here. I wasn't hearing so much of that criticism. Do you think that that's something that is changing, is going to change, and can that help in some ways the struggles that Israelis are currently, facing?
Well, I wonder if I should be using someone like Alan Dershowitz as the barometer for where American Jewry thinks about this stuff. Because because it's an interesting case, right? During the judicial overhaul, even Alan Dershowitz thought that the judicial overhaul was more of an assault and went too far and was kind of, skeptical about it. And now he came out saying, oh, there really is a deep state in Israel and it has to be destroyed. So I don't know. But leaving that aside, joking aside, because I do think that people give him too much attention on some of this stuff. But it is kind of a metaphor, right? Yes, I mean, Americans were really, I think American Jews were surprised by what was going on in 2023. Why would Israel do this? That doesn't sound right. Don't they care about their, the fact that they should be, the democratic and Jewish state? Don't they understand that they're part of the democratic family of nations, such as it is, right? I put that a little bit in quotation marks. And then when the war came around, I think that American Jews felt so under assault, being blamed for the war in Gaza, which in itself is an anti-Semitic position. To blame American Jews or any Jew anywhere in the world for Israel's actions is an anti-Semitic position, but many of them felt that. And I think that their general reaction was to be defensive about it, right? To be defensive of themselves and of Israel. And I think that, as far as I can tell, many people felt like, there was this kind of image that somehow the democratic overhaul was on pause. Israelis said that to themselves too. I remember hearing Israelis say in the first few months, well, the only good thing to come out of this war is that at least they've stopped the judicial assault, which again, I think was fundamentally untrue. And now we see it now coming back in a much more aggressive form in recent weeks, but it was ongoing the whole time, just through different kinds of policies. And so from one thing, I think many American Jews, by the time that information filters to the US, people didn't necessarily realize it was ongoing, even though I tried to write about it in my column in Haaretz many times during the war, but maybe people just had other priorities. And now I think with Trump coming into office, I do think that there should be a new kind of attention to this from American Jews. American Jews, vote Democrat over 70% for the most part, in general, and especially I think this time. And if you look at those numbers, you can imagine that the vast majority of American Jews reject what Trump is doing in America and don't accept it, or don't want to accept it. And I think that the similarities between how the Israeli government is behaving and the kinds of policy positions it's taking and the kind of scattershot approach to attacking Israel's institutions are so familiar to Americans now because they see the same thing happening in front of their eyes that I would like for American Jews to be able to say, we wouldn't tolerate this for ourselves. Why would we want Israelis to live under that kind of a regime? So I don't know if they can help, but people often ask me, what can American Jews do? And I say, first of all, learn the situation for real. Not to accuse anybody of not knowing the situation, but if you really understand this stuff, I would imagine that you'll see a lot of commonalities and understand that there are things that American Jews would find completely anathema to their way of thinking about politics. I think American Jews are in a different position from Israeli Jews. Having lived as a minority in America, from the major waves of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century, Americans are aware of how well liberal democracy has served Jews and how well it has served them, especially in solidarity with other minority groups. And that's why American Jews have been so prominent, I think, in the civil rights and civil liberties communities and preserving democracy in America, and especially those that involve solidarity with other communities. So I'd like for that to be a sensibility and an understanding that American Jews bring to Israel, physically bring to Israel, come to Israel and tell Israelis that, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm kind of fascinated. Our panelists were chosen not because of where they're born and where they live now, but we happen to have an American-born who now lives in Israel.
Canadian-born, actually.
Oh, Canadian-born. And
cling to that these days.
An Israeli who now lives downtown. So it's really fascinating to me also that we didn't mention out loud Trump.
I just did.
Oh, you did say the T word, okay. But the Trump effect is fascinating to me. You said, if I heard you right, that American Jews need to look at Israel and see what's going on. But do either of you think that Trump himself has any influence whatsoever on Netanyahu or what's going on in Israeli policy?
Any influence? He has
can do
huge influence.
Yeah.
He has huge influence. The Biden administration did all of the legwork for negotiating the ceasefire deal and couldn't get it through. And 4 days before Trump took office, his envoy got it through. It's huge influence, right? If you read Israeli analysts now, in any of the Israeli papers, left papers, right-wing papers, pretty much every analyst will come to the same conclusion that the only person who will determine the future of this war, one way or another, is Trump, which is rather remarkable considering that Israel was established so that the Jewish people could have control over their destiny. But he has enormous influence. Of course he does.
And do you think that that is a good thing? I'm asking a pollster.
Oh, you want me to take a normative position on this?
No, I'm asking you to prognosticate rather than poll. we're putting the fate of Israel in Trump's hands? Like it or not, I guess?
I mean,
Lihi?
all I could say is that before the election and when he was elected, I had Trump fantasies. And the fantasies was that he will bring the hostages back. I actually thought, he's out there enough, who knows what he'll do. He can do it. And he can also, I mean, it's true that Israel is an independent sovereign country who should, decide its own fate. But it is being bankrolled by the United States. All the bombs used in this war are supplied by the U.S. The U.S. is fighting this war. It's an American war. And for me, it was unbelievable that Biden had no leverage, given the fact that he's basically, it's his war, but he can't tell Netanyahu what to do. And Trump comes and can say, bring them back, and they're back. I don't know what happened since, right? And I don't know why, as he lost interest, he moved on to something else. What his big plans are. Again, this is not, I don't work on American politics, I work on Israeli, Palestinian politics, but just from my observation, I think that if it is within Trump's interest somehow, with plans with Saudi, with the Gulf, right, with ideas that he has about, the Abraham Accord and Nobel Peace Prize that he wants to promote. He might be the one to achieve something like that, but I don't know where it stands right now. I don't know if you've been following, if you have, insight into the back dealings, what Miriam Edelson is telling him,
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, from what we understand, she actually does have a huge influence over Trump on these issues. But no, I don't think I know any more than what we've seen. That the deal was just, basically negotiated in its final form by the envoy Steve Witkoff. I call him the envoy because he used to be the Middle East envoy, but now he's on Russia-Ukraine. So he's been distracted with Russia-Ukraine. But in the meantime, the administration seems to have lost interest in its own deal. Because this deal was worked out with 3 phases. They were pretty well defined. And somehow, in between the second part of the first phase, before the second phase, when they were supposed to have moved into negotiations for the second phase, not only did Netanyahu kind of push it off, but Trump kind of, flipped the script, as we say. And then Witkoff said, fine, let's renegotiate altogether. And it seems like, I don't know, it sort of calls into question the original deal to begin with. And we don't hear any more of the longer-term vision. We haven't in a long time. Now, it's true that lots of people who are sort of in the orbit of the Trump administration have this image that he wants a Nobel Prize, but I have never heard anybody say it from firsthand knowledge, personally. So I don't really know what that means. Trump is mercurial. And I still think that it is the only real way forward. I mean, people can like or dislike the formula, but I think that Israel, under pretty much any constellation, under any leadership, is not going to just resolve the Palestinian issue through any sort of the idea of a bilateral negotiation leading to a 2-state solution, I think, is dead. But I do think that through a combination of some sort of encouragement / pressure / incentive / direct involvement of the implementation of an agreement with the Palestinians based on ultimately drawing down Israel's occupation, leading to self-determination in some form, can only happen if backed and actively led by the United States, which will, again, to encourage those normalization deals with regional allies and future allies, who will also be directly involved, and some of them have said this openly. The United Arab Emirates has already said that it would be involved in helping, for example, with the reconstruction of Gaza, including physically being there, under the conditions that there is some longer-term vision leading toward Palestinian self-determination. So those pieces have to all come together for that scenario to happen, and I do think that if Trump decides he wants it, yes, he has the leverage to do it. Biden had the leverage to do that too, but he chose not to use that leverage. I mean, nothing speaks louder than, tens of billions of dollars in U.S. aid.
We are at this point now where the audience is able to ask some questions. We see we have 2 very articulate panelists. Gordon, you have both cards if people want to fill out a card, or microphones. So, and predictably, there's 2 questions right up here in the front row.
Do I need to tell either of you to put a question mark at the end? Just kidding.
It seems to me nothing good can happen until occupation ends. And I don't know, I'd like to ask both of you, is there any taste for actually ending occupation? It seems like there's no political constituency for it. Less today than years ago. I see that dynamic going in the wrong direction. So how can anything good happen under any of your scenarios?
Should we take a few or just one by one?
Why don't you answer Kathleen first, and then we'll get to Letty.
Well, it's not that I have an easy answer to Kathleen. She asks tough questions. I would say, if the starting point is that nothing good can happen until the occupation ends, don't hold your breath. So I don't think we have the luxury of waiting. In other words, you can't not oppose the judicial overhaul because the occupation hasn't ended. And at the same time, I don't think Israel will ever fulfill its democratic promise, this part, promise unfulfilled, until it is no longer an occupying country controlling millions of civilians under military law. So those things have to happen in tandem, as we know so well from Israeli, over-quoted cliches. In terms of whether there's a constituency for it, I don't think if you run on a platform of let's end the occupation, you're going to get too many votes today in Israel. That's true. Mm-hmm. But I do think that Israelis, certainly from my survey research, but also from what I see and hear, is that there is an increasing understanding of the changing geopolitics, of what it would mean to have a diplomatic resolution, which is the current terminology, even with the Palestinians. And what do I mean? I'll give you one small example. In the joint survey research that I conduct together with Shikaki, we conduct joint Israeli-Palestinian surveys. The last one we did was in July 2024. And we asked, do you support a two-state solution? Right? We ask it in all of our surveys. That question goes back to the year 2010 in that form. There used to be a majority, now there's only a minority on both sides. In July 2024, it was lower than I've ever seen it since the early 1990s on the Israeli side. And on the Palestinian side, actually, there was a slight rise, but just to about 40%. Among Israelis, at present, according to the most recent Peace Index survey, you have just below 30% who support a two-state solution. In our survey in July, among the Jewish population, it was only about 20%. However, in the very same survey, we ask a bunch of different questions, and finally, by the way, that survey gave me the inspiration for how I structured my talk today. Later in that survey, we said, what if there's a choice for Israel's immediate future? And this was in July, right, before the escalation, the major escalation with Iran, but after the April escalation. We said there could be an all-out regional war. It will involve Israel, the Palestinians, Yemen, Lebanon, and possibly Iran, because that was actually what was happening in July 2024. Or there could be a series of normalization agreements with Arab states, and that will include an Israeli-Palestinian agreement based on a two-state solution. That's how we asked the question, which do you prefer? And what we found is that I think it was 65% of Israelis chose the regional peace option. Now, you might say...
Regional peace.
Peace,
okay.
Yeah. You might say, well, it's obvious. Everybody wants peace. No, we had 45% of the Jewish population who chose regional war, but 55% of the Jewish population who chose the peace option. That's after only 20% had supported the two-state solution in the old terminology. So this isn't just a matter of changing wording. It's a matter of changing the fundamental understanding of what an agreement is. It's not an agreement in which Israelis and Palestinians sit together and make an agreement, because it won't happen. It's an agreement that diversifies the risk, to draw from financial terminology. You're getting other partners involved. You're getting allies involved who Israel trusts. Is it going to be perfect? No, of course not. There is no perfect. People have to stop saying, oh, well, it's not going to be perfect peace, therefore let's not do it. And so we do have indications of people accepting that possibility. That's one kind of indicator that says there is a constituency for moving ahead. Another indicator from the same survey project, not just one survey, is that people change their minds based on incentives. And we say, here's the basic understanding of a two-state solution, but if you add all sorts of factors to sweeten it up, as we say, you have some people changing their minds. And the other indicator is another survey-related indicator is, first of all, what I mentioned before, that the left-wing parties have, specifically the left-wing party represented by Yair Golan, who has roughly 13, 14 seats in polls, but pretty consistently. And that's a constituency that I thought should have just collapsed. And behind electoral choice in survey research lies people's self-identification as left, right, or center. That's the best question we have in surveys for predicting how people will vote. If you tell me your self-identification, left, right, or center, and then how religious you are, I pretty much can tell you which party you're going to vote for before you know which party you're going to vote for, roughly. And during each war and after the wars, we usually see immediately around wars that the right-wing self-identification goes up and left-wing self-identification goes down, and the center sort of stays around the 25%. That's what's happened in all of the recent wars with Gaza, and certainly after the Second Intifada, and after October 7th, I said, that's it. We had 20% of Israelis who identified as left-wing, which means they support a two-state solution, and it's going to, and only 12, 15% of the Jewish population is going to go down to 0, and the total left-wing population is going to go, 10%, just because of the Arabs who are somewhat more identified as left, and the right wing is just going to go up to 100% and then cross 100%. And it's not what happened. It did happen in the beginning. It happened for the first few months. That's what I saw in the self-identification numbers and surveys. That was the direction it was taking, and I thought, this is what I see usually during phases of war. But then actually the self-identification numbers reverted to where they were before, well, mostly before the war, let's say, roughly. And so the trend is still a majority who self-identify as right-wing. Over 50% of the total population, over 60% of the Jewish population, but not as high as it was in those first few months. And the reverse process with the self-identified left. And the center has strangely held. See what I did there? About 25% of the center continues to call themselves center. However, just before you get too optimistic about the prospects for a constituency supporting a two-state solution, remember that what it means to be right-wing in Israel now has taken a different turn. We see a majority who supported the resurgence of the war in surveys, which surprised me because I thought by earlier survey research, there was not a lot of support for restarting the war during the ceasefire. But immediately afterwards, a survey by the Institute for National Security Studies found that about 57% of Israelis supported either the air campaign or ground campaign. And there are surprisingly high numbers who support both, first, voluntary immigration of Palestinians from Gaza, which they call voluntary immigration from Gaza. But the Peace Index survey that tested this just in March, this month, or last month, also found that very high number, nearly half of Jews, even of the Jewish population, supported forced migration of Palestinians from Gaza. So it's true that there's the self-identification as left, right, or center. There's who people vote for, and there's policy positions that they support, some of which are pretty extreme. So it's a mixed picture. It's not going to be an easy path.
I want to add more pessimistic.
More pessimistic.
More pessimistic readings, because I think those public opinion polls are interesting and important, but people act differently. So you have this huge chunk in the center that might be okay with a two-state solution and might be okay with a status quo, but these are people that are not going to do anything to change facts on the ground. On the other hand, you have actors that are constantly working, and that is the far right, or the right in Israel, that is working towards annexation, working towards expansion of settlement, working towards already laying the groundwork for settlement in Gaza. They're the ones who are doing the work, and because I do research on this population, I work with women in the settler movement and in the Islamic movement and Hamas also a long time ago, and the Islamic movement. And these are people, I would speak to a woman, she would have 6 to 11 children, work full-time, volunteer and be politically active, and will give everything to achieve her goal. On the other hand, you have the beautiful, amazing people demonstrating in the streets in Tel Aviv, and I don't want to take away from that, but they have to do the demonstration and then they have to have their latte, right? I mean, I'm not mistaken, right? And even I have 2 children, and I have a job, and it's already hard, and I want to do yoga sometimes. So you have that population in Israel. As long as the occupation is not costing them anything, they're not going to do anything about it, even if they think it's not ideal. I thought that October 7 is going to be this wake-up call, saying as long as we have occupation, as long as we have this conflict, we are not safe. We're not safe. We can't have our nature parties and enjoy our life. I don't know if Israelis are going to go there. Now, I think they're still processing the trauma. But I hope that at some point the costs of the conflict, the cost of occupation are going to be too much for Israelis, for that for the majority of Israelis, where they will say, we have to end this, we have to solve this.
Just to add to the non-optimistic analysis, the idea that Israelis would say, well, this unresolved conflict, this occupation is costing us so much. It's true that many people who support a two-state solution or support, end of occupation, thought that would be the obvious conclusion. But I think, for the vast majority of Israelis, I didn't need a poll to know this, but I have also polled on it. That's not how they read what happened up until now. Mm-hmm. And what they believe, again, I'm talking about 80% of the Jewish community, which obviously is lower when you take the average of the Arab population as well, but the vast majority of Israelis in general believe that Israel gave up Gaza, let them control their own lives, and look what Gazans did with it. Mm-hmm. They even believe that Israel gave up the West Bank in Oslo, and look what they did with it. So that is a very fundamental belief. I don't think I realized how, I think I knew that that's what Israelis say, but I don't think I realized how prominent it was until after the war, when, first of all, there were, not just a million different columns and general sort of media conversations around it, but the general public firmly believes that October 7th was the cost that Israel paid for Oslo and the disengagement in 2005.
Wow. There were two more questions. So first Letty and then you, sir.
I'll keep my answer short, I promise.
Letty, do you want to identify your role in Peace Now and stuff?
I was president of Americans for Peace Now for 6 years, I think. So I'm fascinated by internal Palestinian politics. And since it's often been said that you can't negotiate with them because it's a bifurcated government and no deal is going to work because they're not under one umbrella and so on. And there was a lot of talk for a while about succession to Abu Mazen. And I remember names like, what about if Israel realizes to let, Barghouti out of jail? What about Nasser al-Kidwa? What about Mahmoud or Mohammed Dahlan? There were these names, and now we're hearing nothing. At least I'm hearing nothing, and I'm pretty much following as best I can. Are you clear about what's happening in terms of succession? And now that there's a little bit of a groundswell to resist Hamas in Gaza, what impact will that have on somehow or other knitting together the two parts?
Lihi, you want to go first?
No, I actually don't know. That's something that we have to pay more attention to. I think you need to have a succession, right? To have all of these people. Netanyahu have been there for a long time. Abbas have been there for a long time. The split between Fatah and Hamas has been there for a long time, and it's worked in everybody's interest, in all these leaders' interest, not in their people's interest. So I do think that you need to have the succession, and you need to have elections in Palestine, right? Again, another thing that Israelis say is they elected Hamas. They didn't elect Hamas. Hamas had a tiny, slim majority that was in 2006.
Plurality.
What? Plurality, not even majority, right? A plurality because of very problematic gerrymandering and electoral laws in the Palestinian Authority. So 20 years ago, Palestinians had an opportunity to elect. I think Abbas was elected in 2005 even. They have presidential elections since then. So they've been living under oppressive authoritarian regimes, under military occupation. And of course, under these conditions, nothing could have proceeded, but also this worked great for Netanyahu and for successive Israeli governments, including Netanyahu, who said explicitly that Hamas is great, we have to keep them in power because as long as they're there, we don't have to make any concessions to Abu Mazen and in the West Bank. I think I have to say Palestinian politics always depress me. Always the worst thing that could happen would happen. I don't know if you have more insight. I don't know if Khalil Shikak is more optimistic, if he has some... in the polling, Barghouti gets more than any candidate from Hamas or any candidate from Fatah, usually. But he's in jail, yeah.
I think that, from all the Palestinian colleagues that I speak to about this, they're about as confused as you are regarding succession. I can tell you that nobody should be surprised, particularly by the demonstrations we've seen in Gaza recently. Anybody who knows people in Gaza, you know that there's been rage and fury at Hamas for a long time, including before the war, right? Their polling was pretty abysmal before the war. It went up after October 7th, which is, the reality, and then it went back down. And in Gaza, by the way, it didn't really go up. It went up primarily in the West Bank. And in Gaza, it got a few points boost and then is back down to where it was. And in the West Bank, and in general, West Bank and Gaza, polling for Abu Mazen and for the PA is abysmal and is really awful. So, at the level of public legitimacy, they have none. Not Fatah, not Hamas. There's basically a crisis of Palestinian leadership. As far as I know, there's not been much progress on the succession issue, on how to choose one even. There are some people who are being sort of semi-named. There's no indication, I don't have any indication from people I speak to that Israel is considering releasing Marwan Barghouti. And I'm also a little bit cautious about the assumption that if Marwan Barghouti was released tomorrow, suddenly he could just make it all come together, because he hasn't been tested. He has credibility among Palestinians because he's in jail. He doesn't have responsibility for anything. And then I have a big dispute with some of my colleagues who are sort of inside the Palestinian political system. I think that there could be more effort to forge a vision for how to choose the next Palestinian leadership. And I have Palestinian colleagues who are regularly talking, not just colleagues, but also people that you can just speak to, who are not necessarily political activists, who kind of converge around the idea that there must be a technocratic transitional government of some sort. Technocratic meaning people from civil society and people from the teachers' unions or student unions or labor unions, people who have some sort of credibility and maybe even were elected in their organizations, who can form a kind of transitional government to establish the processes by which they will choose probably the next leadership and eventually lay the groundwork for elections. And I think Salam Fayyad. Well, Salam Fayyad, I think,
he's a technocrat.
I just saw him in Princeton. He's, not. Yeah, I made the transfer on time. Well, that has associations as well. Letty, please.
Do we have time for one more question?
It might be a little too long to get into the whole story of why Salam Fayyad didn't work out, but let's just say it's a combination of him wanting to build institutions that would actually implement Palestinian sovereignty rather than waiting for the political conditions to be right for Israel and the Palestinians to agree on Palestinian sovereignty, which I think was a very good instinct. My PhD is on unrecognized states, trying to seek recognition and get sovereignty. And it was absolutely the direction those other cases have taken, right? It's the direction of Kosovo and, what used to be Nagorno-Karabakh, which worked for a while. On the other hand, Israel is not really in the same category. Palestine is much more heavily controlled by Israel. So there's only so much you could do in terms of institution building to actually advance economic, social, political life, but particularly economic viability, which was his kind of, the centerpiece of his program. It's just extremely constrained when all of the factors you would need for effective economic sovereignty are controlled by Israel, some of them according to the Oslo agreements, but not really independent enough to be able to flourish. And then he lost credibility, and then his association with the PA, which every Palestinian sees as corrupt, essentially made him lose credibility. So it's a short answer. But I do think that Palestinians, it is incumbent upon them to think about the process for establishing a unified government. And then some people take the position that that's totally impossible under occupation because Israel will find a way to undermine that, even now. Right? Netanyahu had the money flowing to Hamas over the years, but even now, after 17 months of war, 17, 18, whatever it is, Netanyahu has not been willing to consider any alternative. And so Hamas is still there.
All right. Let's get that. Sir, you had...
Yes.
You're the last question.
Okay. Is there any concern in Israel about what I perceive to be the total disaffection of young American Jews towards Israel? Is not neutral, then even negative currently as a result of the activities in Israel?
You want to start with this? You live here.
Yeah, no, I live there, so I can speak to the American part. And I think, I don't know about the polling, because I think October 7th changed that a little bit. I think you've had this growing disaffection of young generations of American Jews with Israel. Just speaking from someone who is on college campuses and teach, my Modern Israel class is oversubscribed. I have over 100 students, and everybody wants to learn more about Israel, and I think reconnect to Israel and that merging of Jewish identity and support for Israel post-October 7, and now with what's happening on college campuses, with the protest and with the fight against anti-Semitism and what the Trump administration is doing, I feel there is a reconstitution here. So I don't know where that is going. As far as the Israeli government, I haven't seen them really trying to attract those disaffected youth. I think they've kind of doubled down on actually, the kind of illiberal values and agendas that are turning off a lot of American Jews, that are concerned, even if not about the Israel-Palestinian issues, about Jewish pluralism and religious freedom in Israel. I haven't seen the government doing anything in that regard. Even worse, in part of the judicial overhaul, some of the suggestions were to increase the power of rabbinical courts, for example, to create more restrictions around the Western role and practices around the Western wall and limit Jewish pluralism. So I haven't seen any response that has been positive. But at the same time, I think something's happening in the U.S. in terms of American Jews' relation to Israel, and I'm really interested in seeing how it plays out. I'm not sure where it's going to fall after 4 years of Trump.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I would just say, again, from the polling perspective, what I see is that remember that in the U.S., the Jewish population is still very heavily pro-Israel. And yes, the younger Jews are more critical of Israel, but they're still majority pro-Israel. So there's a distinction by age, but the bigger picture is still there. But of course, there is a very different frame of reference, I think. Like I said before, American Jews in general, especially young American Jews, many of whom are involved in progressive activities here in the U.S., don't understand the illiberal turn that Israel's taking, don't understand why Israelis would take that direction, and yet the government doesn't seem concerned about it at all, right? The government is a completely different program. And I would say for the rest of for general Israeli society, I have to be honest, war is all-consuming. Following the 7th of October, we think about little else. And certainly in the first few months, it was so overwhelming. There was no room for anything beyond the country. Israel can be rather inward-looking in general. Sometimes I even think it's a little parochial. But it was completely consumed with coping with the displacement, with people just trying to figure out where your loved ones were. Everybody knew somebody who had been, kidnapped or killed or somewhere or displaced. And then, of course, the media, also paid a lot of attention to every individual story. So all of the time that wasn't taken up in media conversations with just what's going on in the war, all the rest of the time was filled in by telling personal stories. What happened on October 7th? What about your family? What about your child? What about your, husband, brother, daughter, sister? Personal stories took up huge amount of Israeli attention in conversations and in the media. And there was almost no room for any foreign media, foreign affairs coverage in general. And if anything penetrated that from the outside world, it was what's going on in America a little bit, and then a little tiny subset of that. Occasionally there might be a headline about what American Jews are thinking, but it's very, very marginal right now to the conversation, I have to be honest.
I want to close with, I've been asked to close on an optimistic note. So this is my optimistic note. Dahlia Scheindlin, the crooked timber of democracy in Israel, promise unfulfilled. And Lihi Ben-Shitrit, the gates of Gaza, critical voices from Israel on October 7th and the war with Hamas. What am I optimistic about? I'm sitting next to two leaders who Dahlia writes for Haaretz in English, and you should be reading her.
Occasionally in Hebrew.
Occasionally in Hebrew. I read you in English. No. But, and always incisive. Lihi runs the Taub Center for Israel Studies at NYU. They are influencing the next generation, and we are blessed to have leaders such as these. Thank you.
So it's my somewhat bittersweet task, I guess, on behalf of our Chancellor, Shuli Rubin Schwartz, and her whole cabinet, and everyone who's put so much heart and soul and work into this convening to bring it to a close. I think among the people, I'm going to ask you to applaud once more, but this time I'm asking you to applaud for yourselves because this has been such an extraordinary assemblage of people who have come to learn, to be with one another. All of the conversations that were going on in all of the breaks were very, very rich, and this would not have happened without all of you. So give yourselves a hand. I hope that you will keep everything that happened in these last 2 days in mind. If you want to revisit them, as I said, nearly all of it will be on our website. You can re-listen. You can share the things that you've learned with others. Watch for the webinar series that will follow, and look for follow-ups that may come to your communities. And know that we are already beginning to think about a theme for a fall convening, probably at the end of October, and the wheels are starting to turn for that. So in the way of ending, also on a little bit of a positive note, I'm going to repeat something that I said yesterday in opening the conference, primarily because a number of people told me that it resonated for them, and I think it's an important thing to remember. I was quoting an Austrian philosopher from 100 years ago who was talking about something a little bit different. It was about how to build a scientific theory that would work, but it applies to everything that we've been talking about here. As people who love Israel and want to see it traveling a correct and secure and just path. This is what he said: "We are like sailors who must rebuild their ship on the open sea, never able to dismantle it in dry dock and to reconstruct it there out of the best materials. We can't do that. We can keep the ship of state and the ship of the community sailing, and believe and hope that we will be able during that journey to find the ways to make it more perfect than it is now." And I think that's the kind of hope that we should have. Because this is also a religious institution, I'm just going to end entirely with a little prayer, which is just a very slight variation on something that goes back to the Talmud. Mi sheshikein shemo b'kirbenu, hu yashkin beinenu ahava v'yachava v'shalom v'reut. May the divine name that lives on our tongues inspire us to love, to solidarity, to peace, and to friendship. And amen. Amen. And thank you. Thank you.